we have. And Mr. Manoba, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, Your Honors, the legal representatives for victims present this opening statement on behalf of over 2,600 victims granted status to participate in the proceedings against Mr. Dominic Ongwen. These victims are former residents of the IDP camps located in Odek, Lukodi, and Abok in the present-day districts of Gulu and Oyam, respectively. The views presented in this statement were gathered from consultations with the majority of our clients. Our clients wish this court to know that there are many people who didn't have a chance to apply to participate in these proceedings because of the time constraints. However, be that as it may, they share similar experiences of the views and concerns that we speak about today. Our clients recall that on the 23rd of March 2016, Pretrial Chamber 2 of this court issued a decision confirming 70 charges against the accused Dominic Ongwen and moved the case to trial for the alleged crimes against humanity and war crimes perpetrated in the IDP camps of Odek on the 29th of April 2004, in Lukodi on the 19th May 2004, and Abok on the 8th of June 2004. The prosecution, of course, has already spoken to the specific crimes that have been perpetrated in these IDP camps. And of course, for the thematic crimes of sexual violence and sexual and gender-based violence, persecution, and conscripting and using children to engage in hostilities. It is on the premise of the confirmed charges, Your Honors, that our clients present the following views and at the commencement of the opening of the trial of Mr. Dominic Ongwen. Before the coming of guns, as our client puts it, one of our clients puts it, it was common to find elderly men and women in the communities and in most homes. These were the fountains and custodians of culture and ways of life. In this setting, our clients recall that life was very community-based. Extended families and clans played a fundamental role in shaping the community lives. Cultural norms and traditions were passed on through elders, and young people respected their elders and the traditions of the community. Core cultural principles were respected. These were things such as prohibitions on killings, stealing, and domestic violence. And of course, the principle that orphans should be cared for. Mr. President, Your Honors, children in the African setting are very important aspects. They do lots of things to support their families. Elders, cultural, religious, and political leaders were equally fountains of honor and discipline. Through these institutions, the community was properly governed and people managed their differences through the appropriate structures because they gave directions and resolved disputes. They assisted the community to plan long-term, such as averting potential famine. The community at large, to a large extent, was united by common bonds of humanity, hence the ability to work together through planning and adopting strategies to address common threats and challenges. The people of the greater north of Uganda, and more particularly residents of what came to be Odek, Lukodi, and Abok IDP camps, took pride in their livelihoods, wherein they farmed, reared animals, indulged in commercial activity, celebrated their Choli and Lango cultures, educated their children, and traveled peacefully to various parts of the country, among other things. The communities were economically sustainable through the utilization of the land resource, which to a great extent was owned in common among the clans and families. Through farming, families were able to yield enough support to sustain themselves. Majority of the families and households owned and maintained livestock, some on large scale and others on small scale, depending on their means. This is because livestock provided the basis for the local economy. Livestock was a medium for transactions on the one hand, and a means for plowing fields for cultivation. There was a concept of brotherhood among the communities because it provided a means for various categories of deprived persons in communities to share and access food and hence enjoy a livelihood. The victims also acknowledged that, like in any society, there were occasions of violence and criminal activity in the communities which were addressed by the existing formal justice mechanisms obtaining in the country, and others, of course, were settled by the existing customs and resolving conflicts and life and other aspects of daily living, which went on fairly, normal. It is significant to note that communities lived peacefully and were not fearful. People went about their activities freely and were not scared to move about their communities, even at night. That was what it was before the coming of the guns. Then there was the question of the camps and the attacks on their camps. We have heard from the prosecution about the attacks on the civilians in the camps, the subject of this case against Dominic Ongwen. Our clients want your honors to know that living in the IDP camps is incomparable to living in their real homes. The IDP camps were places of refuge that did not offer the tranquility of a family home setting. The camps came because the guns came to the communities, and which communities did not invite the guns. The government of Uganda created the camps as protected villages, and communities in large numbers were displaced into these IDP camps. Our client, victim A/0550/15, recalls that the government of Uganda gave people 48 hours to get out of their villages. People were forced to go to trading centers, which was a big challenge for many people. And however, in the year 2000, following increased violence by the LRA, people were forced to go to these camps, especially after LRA fighters were killed in the locality of this particular victim. The camps, your honors, were established in trading centers which could be located very long distances from where people had previously been living and carrying out livelihood activities. The prosecution has showed aerial view of the former locations of the IDP camps, which is useful to have an appreciation of the movement of the LRA at the time of the attacks on these camps. This aerial view of the IDP camps does not tell the full story of life of many of the victims before and after the attacks. Life in the camps was difficult. The camps were themselves undignified, overcrowded, and with very scant sanitary facilities for the large number of people resident. People didn't have any place to farm, so if they wanted food, they had to find it in their own gardens, and this meant that they had to travel far and take a very risky journey to do so. They could be killed or arrested by the government forces, the UPDF, or accused by the same UPDF for being LRA collaborators, on the one hand. And they could be attacked and killed, obviously, by the notorious LRA. Many children could not go to school anymore because of the distances which were too great and the insecurity that prevailed in the communities. Movement into the camps was the beginning of the destruction of the existing social and cultural structures that contributed to moral upbringing and discipline in society. The establishment of the camps came with the deployment of government soldiers to offer protection to the camps. However, oftentimes, the deployments were insignificant compared to the populations in the camps. Hence, the LRA's ability to launch successful attacks on the civilian populations. The establishment of protected villages is also blamed for the loss of livestock, as both government soldiers and the LRA took advantage of the situation to deprive owners of their herds. These developments, Your Honors, had impacts on the victims and the communities. Our clients informed this court that the LRA armed and violent attacks at Lukodi, at Odek, at Abok, forever changed life and the way of life of all camp residents, their relatives, and the events shocked humanity at large in a way that is hitherto unknown in the said local communities. The attacks were swift and exceedingly brutal. In the span of 2 to 3 hours, victims in the protected camps were further displaced, rendered homeless, and deprived of food rations and livelihoods, dignity, and were bereaved as well. Family members were abducted. In short, the devastation was absolute. Like the Office of the Prosecutor has shown, the attacks were indiscriminately perpetrated and had no regard for human life, as a number of people were killed by the LRA fighters, either by being shot at or being burnt alive in their houses. These houses, of course, provided shelter, comfort, and a sense of security as homes. Adults and children alike, including infants, were subjected to cruel and inhuman treatment. Others were subjected to torture. Young girl children were especially targeted for abduction because whilst in the bush, they were distributed amongst the LRA commanders. Outrages upon personal dignity were committed without remorse to fellow human beings. Domestic animals and sources of livelihoods were pillaged with impunity, and other crimes as included in the charges, in the 70 charges laid out by the prosecutor. The impacts of the attacks on the respective IDP camps of Odek, Lukodi, and Abok have not merely impacted on the individual victims that we represent, but on entire communities. These impacts have had a devastating effect to life, way of life, and livelihoods, as we demonstrate. Physical harm. Many victims were grievously injured in the attacks themselves. Those who were abducted were mostly forced to carry extremely heavy loads of looted items over long distances. As we have heard, many were beaten, and the result of this cruelty on fellow human beings has caused them to suffer ongoing physical problems. Others were injured as they fled for their lives. The victims note that much of this physical harm continues to this day because of inadequate health care. Indeed, many victims have never received sufficient medical treatment they require. Some NGOs have provided health care efforts on a temporary basis, but this is unsustainable. For many people, the physical injuries they continue to suffer from are not only a source of pain, but a hindrance to their livelihoods and their abilities to care for their families because they cannot go out to the fields and prepare the gardens and work for their families. Trauma and traumatic experiences cannot be left out of the equation. The severity and the savagery of the violence has left deep scars within the psyche of many members of the community. Victims are haunted by the memories of death and destruction that included the sight of numerous dead bodies, often with relatives and friends among them. Some victims watched helplessly as their family members were indiscriminately murdered. Others who fled for their lives only returned to the site of their dead relatives, shot or bludgeoned or burned in their houses. Many cannot forget the disturbing scenes of domestic animals eating human flesh. Others relive the horrific incidents from the day of the violent attacks, especially outrages and the inhuman treatment subjected to many of the camp residents. The failure, Your Honors, to conduct decent burials for some deceased persons has triggered psychological and psychosocial trauma, including people hearing voices of persons who were killed. Sustained effects of sexual violence. These are among victims of SGBV or sexual and gender-based crimes, because many of them have not received appropriate medical and psychological attention to assist in the treatment of these effects. Social stigma. This affects both child mothers and their children, fathered by the LRA commanders during the Bush. There is the additional harm to parents and other family members of those who were abducted and who have not returned. To this day, they don't know the fate of their family members and only await for news that may arrive about their being alive or not. The effects to women. Your Honors, the effects of gender-based violence continue to be felt by the women who experienced it, including physical effects and trauma. Many women have been stigmatized in the community because of the sexual violence and forced marriage they suffered. Women who had children in the bush additionally suffer because with these children, they have nowhere to go. The mothers lack the resources and the means to care for their children. Women today shoulder the burden for providing for the family because some of the men were killed, others were injured, and others have abandoned their responsibilities to the women. Women now serve as sole providers, as a result of the consequences of the physical harm and illness that has been sustained. Some women are vulnerable and at risk of losing access to land resources, especially after the death of their spouses, because of the cultural prejudices against women that obtains in the country. There was impact, Your Honors, to children and youth that we wish to highlight. An entire generation has grown from childhood to adulthood knowing mostly conflict and the extreme privations that followed the armed clashes. Loss of opportunities. These children have grown up, have not been able to have the opportunity to grow up in proper family setups, to learn and participate in their culture, to receive appropriate education. Many children have not had, especially the girl children, to mature into adults as opposed to being subjected to forced sexual relations with LRA commanders. Our client, victim A5721/15, states that because of the conflict, there are many orphans as a result of destroyed and looted properties. And as victims, they cannot afford to properly educate their children. This view is similarly expressed by victim A/5307/15. Your Honors, children were abducted into the LRA. Children that were abducted into the LRA have returned to social stigma in their communities as a result of their involvement in the conflict against their will. Those who lived through the conflict, whether as abductees or those who survived attacks, witnessed horrific scenes. Many have been forced to commit horrific acts. And because of their young age, they suffer disproportionately as a result of these experiences from trauma and ongoing psychological harm. There are those children, abductees, who escaped from their abductors and have been subjected to the amnesty process by the government of Uganda. The issuance of amnesty certificates to these children has caused further problems. The children are now treated or have tags of proof of having been within the LRA. And therefore, this has consequences that they can be prevented from accessing gainful employment or even traveling. Your Honors, the conflict had impact on the economic structures of the communities. Our clients informed this court that there was loss, or they suffered loss of household and other family properties, including livestock, which impacts on community livelihoods and the local economy. As I have indicated before, the livestock offered avenues for transactions and, of course, sustaining agriculture in the communities. The attacks rendered people destitute. Many people were left with only the clothes they were wearing, thus forced to endure the indignity of wearing the same clothing day in and day out. The pillage of food resources exposed many to the risk of hunger. The loss of family heads and providers has led to increased number of needy and unsupported children. The attacks also forced some people to abandon their villages and go to towns or trading centers, where they move from one place to another in an attempt to find ways of living. Community structures were not spared, Your Honors, by this conflict. The loss of family heads meant that families lost unifying factors for individual clans and households. The respect for traditional leaderships, elders, and governance structures has been lost. Elders in the community that once took the responsibility to provide and guide the youth these days focus on themselves and their immediate families. A whole new generation born and raised in the camps has lost principles for culture and tradition and the way of life of the communities in these areas. Our clients note that there is generally a loss of desire to gainfully work amongst the youth, which is a very serious concern among the elderly. Alcoholism is widespread, and it leads to further economic problems. Many men spend all their money and even sell their customary land without consulting their spouses, to the detriment of the little children. There are cases of increased domestic violence in the communities. many people no longer think and plan for the future. They only live for today and tomorrow, and not tomorrow, because they have no knowledge whether they will be able to continue much longer. And people only think about borrowing from their immediate, borrowing for their immediate needs, as opposed to producing sustainably. There are, of course, increasing numbers of orphans who today are not cared for, and in fact have rendered many to be street children. The social structures which existed previously for their care no longer exist, and there is nobody to look after many of these children. Land conflicts have arisen because of the destruction of the traditional landmarks on the one hand, and the related stigma the destruction of traditional landmarks because of moving into the IDP camps that were created by the government. Mr. President, Your Honors, I will now invite my colleague, Mr. Cox, to conclude our statement with a few remarks on the remaining parts. Thank you.
Mr. President, Your Honors, the people we represent believe Dominic Ongwen to be responsible for the crimes that he is accused. It is interesting to convey to the court the process by which this conviction or this sense was brought up in the community. As in here, and probably in the mind of all of us, in the communities, the questions were raised when we were making consultation. Is Dominic Ongwen a victim or a criminal? And it's interesting how among themselves, among the community, they answered this question. As one client of us said, he was abducted as a child, but when he became an adult, he had the option to leave. He did not, because he found the work so nice. Victims note that Mr. Dominic Ongwen was himself an abductee, but they also mention that many of them, when had the opportunity given to them, they flee. We would like to show some examples and what they went through to leave the grip of the LRA. Some women escaped together with their young children. Others escaped despite the fact that they had suffered serious injuries during their ordeal. One woman described how she had suffered a prolapsed uterus from repeated rapes and that she was extremely weak. Nonetheless, she managed to escape. And I'm talking about our client A/06797/15. Abductees managed to escape in many ways. Some took the opportunity to escape when they were sent to gather food. Others took the advantage of the confusion during the battle with the UPDF. One victim, who was only 12 years old at the time of his abduction, describes how he escaped after 2 years by simply allowing himself to fall behind as his rebel group approached an attack. This is our client A/07089/15. Among the participant victims are children who managed to escape the LRA captors when they were as young as 9 years old. The challenges that children overcame in order to escape from the LRA are exemplified by one victim who told his story of having been abducted during the attack of Lukoti when he was only 10 years old. He described in detail the journey he was forced to go through. He had stolen goods, had seen other children killed, and how himself was severely and violently beaten and starved. He heard the LRA planning to use the abductees in an attack. He was hungry, in pain, and no doubt terrified. However, at the first opportunity he had, when he was sent to gather water with another abductee, he escaped. His feet were injured, swollen, and he could not walk, and he had no shirt. Despite this, he crawled, bare-chested, through, therefore covered in sores, to his freedom. Your Honor, we would like to convey to you the significance that this trial has for our representative. Victims note here, as they noted at the confirmation of charges hearing, that the trial of Mr. Dominic Ongwen is extremely significant because it offers them the only tangible opportunity for justice to be done for any crimes committed by the LRA and its top commanders against civilians in a time frame of 29 years. The individual sufferings that has been experienced from the days of the attack, but that endured until now, as my colleague has mentioned, have touched all aspects of the lives of victims. And we must be honest, some victims have expressed their desire for retribution. However, once again, talking among themselves, they are more interested in justice, as we will see. It is in this context of request for retribution that some voices have risen to ask for forgiveness for the acts committed. But this request for forgiveness, or these voices that request forgiveness, come from people that still have children as abductees. And they believe that the only way they might come home is if they forgive. It was also uttered in a context in which Dominic Ongwen, as they have said, had the guns, his bodyguards, and his troops. Thus, the fear for even uttering the word justice. Other people speak of forgiveness for religious reasons. It's usually the people that do not suffer the consequences of crimes that request for forgiveness. This, Your Honor, does not mean that victims are not seeking justice. Quite the contrary. To ask for forgiveness or to give forgiveness, you must request it. As we all saw yesterday, Mr. Dominic Ongwen has never asked for forgiveness. He just wants to separate himself from the charges. How can you forgive if you have not requested forgiveness? And forgiving and forgetting are not the same thing. As one of our clients says, many people are talking about forgiveness and reconciliation and other things. People may say forgive, but we never forget. This forgiveness, where there is forgetting, it is like a time bomb. But now, Your Honors, that Dominic Ongwen does not have the guns, does not have his bodyguards, and does not have his troops, victims are talking about justice, are seeking justice, and are applying for justice in this court. Justice in the sense of criminal justice and criminal punishment, and also in compensation and reparation. It was the culture among the Acholi culture that for the commission of a grievous crime, justice would be done publicly. The community leaders would seek to establish the truth and some reparation to be issued by the offending party and his or her community. As one victim has noted, in a Choli custom, compensation would be a question between the clans of the victim and the clan of Dominic Ongwen. They have to sit around the table and agree on compensation. But first, this court must decide whether he is guilty and what punishment and compensation should be set. The victims are confident and put a lot of trust in these proceedings. They have spoken about the transparency, the rights of the accused, and how you can see how justice is being done. Victims know that if Mr. Dominic Ongwen is not punished for the crimes he perpetrated as a senior commander in the LRA ranks and personally, this will leave them even in a higher sense of hopelessness. As no other perpetrator, state, whether state or non-state actor, has been tried and held responsible for the crimes perpetrated in Lukodi, Odek, or Abok. And indeed, all other parts of the country where the armed conflict between UPDF and the LRA happened. This effectively leaves the impunity gap and no precedent holding such individuals responsible. And that is a threat for peace. As victim A06546/15 says, if the accused, Dominic Ongwen, is not punished, impunity will prevail. The victims, therefore, ask for justice. In the words of another client of ours, if we kill Dominic Ongwen, is that going to pay for our people who died? I think not. Is it going to stop others from killing? I think the answer is also no. It is only when it's put on legal process and everybody's aware of what happened to him that he becomes an example. That is what we want. In other words, they want the International Criminal Court, the international community, shocked by the crimes that had been committed, to deliver justice and to reaffirm the values common to all humankind. Your Honors, there's a paradox in these type of crimes, which is due to the large number of victims, the individual victims are erased. We talk about large numbers, and for protective measures, we have to refer to people as numbers. But it's important to remember that behind each number, there is an individual, a person that has suffered the consequences, that there's a community that has also suffered the consequences of these crimes. It is moving to see how many thousands of people from Abok, from Lukodi, have come to see the opening of this trial. This shows that international justice, though may seem a very abstract concept, a very far away concept, a trial that is being held at The Hague in this modern facility is done and must be done for those who suffered the consequences of the crimes. Obviously, the victims. It is why we've created this institution as humankind, and it's why the victims kindly request you deliver justice. Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you very much. It is close to 1 o'clock. We will have now the lunch break until 2:30.
All rise. Vi will